Let's go racing! It's Super Mario Kart Funny Car Madness! Only on Super NES! Turn the track into a giant mud pit! Or burn rubber on ice, wood, or asphalt! Mix it up for the big boy! Two-player fun on the split screen! Only for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System! Now you're playing with power, superpower!
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Super Nintendo review here on Player One Start. In this video, we're going to take a look at racing and sports games on the Super Nintendo, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm going to let you know up front that I'm not a big fan of sports games in general, and I feel like these are the games that have aged the least gracefully from this generation on any platform, not just the Super Nintendo. With racing games in particular, they would push the console to their theoretical limits, trying to offer a 3D style experience using 2D tools. Although there would be some trickery to make it look like you were playing games in 3D, and the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 would be heavily used here. With sports games as well, if they were trying to go for a more realistic style of game, those haven't aged as gracefully as there were tons of compromises that had to be made due to the system's hardware. However, if the game was designed from the ground up, with these limitations in mind, and they had a focus on providing a fun gameplay experience, some of these are quite fun to go back to. Let's go ahead and take a look, starting with the racing games. When researching titles to include in the racing games portion of this review, I consistently found Top Gear in the #1 spot on several lists, with many calling this a classic title that offers high-speed excitement as well as addictive gameplay. I saw several mentions to smooth controls, challenging tracks, and intense competition. But for my personal experience, this is one I didn't grow up with, so I kinda have the nostalgia goggles off on this one. However, I do appreciate the fact that they were able to do a two-player raster-style arcade experience on the Super Nintendo. This game does remind me of like Hang On or Outrun, and I really feel like it's done very well here on this system, and is one I would definitely recommend, especially for that two-player feature. The only thing that holds me back from giving this a better score than 8 out of 10 is the outdated style of using this raster-style effect. Some people may not find that as fun, but I sure as heck find it nostalgic. Another game I can devote an entire video to is Super Mario Kart. This game is another original to my collection, having received it in summer of 1993. Super Mario Kart had its origins trying to make a two-player version of F-Zero, but during the development process they used Mario-style characters just as placeholders and eventually decided to make it Super Mario Kart with an emphasis on battle more than racing. While this game did give birth to one of Nintendo's most iconic and successful franchises of all time, I feel like I see a lot of modern gamers who didn't grow up with this game have a lot more criticism of it. And I think it all comes down to the fact that that Mode 7 effect looks terrible on modern displays. It doesn't look much better on a CRT, but that's the style I grew up with, and so I'm okay with it. The game does take a little bit to learn how to race correctly on the tracks. Even though the controls are simple, the physics seem a bit off to me, even when I was a kid. That said, I would give this a 9 out of 10 and recommend it as an essential for your Super Nintendo, just because in the end, it is Mario Kart. Now here I'm going to kind of combine 3 reviews into one because I had very similar experiences with all of these. First, these 3 games often appear in top 10 lists for the best racing games on the platform. This first one, Rock and Roll Racing, is done with an isometric perspective, and is one that I personally don't really care for because, eventually, when you turn towards the screen, your controls are flipped. This leads to a lot of frustration to me because I have never been a fan of this racing style. Biker Mice from Mars also gets on top 10 racing games lists, and this one is just as well designed as Rock and Roll Racing, but I think the reason why it keeps getting nostalgic hits is because of its content matter. It's just a unique game. But again, this is one I didn't really enjoy as well because of that isometric perspective. And I will reiterate, this has nothing to do with how the game looks, it's all on how the game controls. This last one here was actually an iconic title in the arcades, and I did enjoy playing it with a steering wheel back in the day, and it performs admirably on the SNES, and out of all three of these, I would say Super Off-Road would be the only one I would recommend. But I have to say it's only for hardcore racing fans, because I don't think everyone's going to get a lot of enjoyment out of this, maybe more of a momentary thrill. However, the sequel, Super Off-Road the Baja, I can't recommend strongly enough. I feel like this is a game that kind of gets overlooked and wasn't included in a lot of top 10 racing games lists, but if you take a look at it, this game is visually outstanding. And if you see the results, yes, the gameplay does suffer a little bit because the frame rate is slowed down a bit, which is not ideal, especially in a racing game, but I didn't really mind it back in the day, and once I started playing for this review, I had a hard time putting this down, almost beating the game in one playthrough. If you were looking for a single-player racing experience, I think this one will satisfy most, although I will say most of the challenge of this game actually comes from setting up your truck for the next course, and while you're racing, you just gotta make sure you don't have more damage than you do distance, and you'll be fine. There are also constantly obstacles in your way on the course that will damage your truck, or take away money that you win, especially every time I kill one of these ATV riders or bystanders. Overall, I give this around a 7.5 out of 10, but I would definitely recommend it because it's not that expensive last I looked, and it will definitely provide you with a racing experience on the Super Nintendo that will be memorable. The last racing game I'm going to cover here is Power Rangers Zeo, which is not one I was expecting to like, but ended up loving this game. And I'm going to note, I am not the biggest fan of Power Rangers, I didn't grow up with this game, and I didn't even know this existed on the platform until this review. I decided to give this one a shot. The game really does play a lot like a Mario Kart style racing clone, and I'm okay with that. They actually pulled it off and it plays very well. The controls are responsive, the combat and power-ups seem fair and balanced, and I'm going to add on a personal note, the two-player in this game is also very fun. I'd give this around an 8 out of 10 and recommend it to people who can find it. I definitely feel like this is a hidden gem. I'm going to note that my opinion seems to be against the grain on this one, so I'm not going to say it's as good as Mario Kart, but it's better than the reviews out there say. Before I move on though, I will make a special note about the two games that are in this genre that use the Super FX chip. The first one here is Trax FX, and my opinion of this game is just kind of meh. It's not blatantly terrible, but not one that I personally enjoyed playing. It could be a bit smoother in terms of its presentation, but it's actually on par with the other Super FX titles. Review scores of this game range between 8 out of 10 and 5 out of 10. It'd rank at about a 6.5 out of 10 for me. I wouldn't recommend it as essential, but it is one of the few 3D racing games on the system. Out of the two Super FX racing games, I would recommend Stunt Race FX. This game was developed by Nintendo themselves, and kind of includes the best of both worlds from Super Mario Kart and F-Zero. There's not a lot of variety of weapons you can pick up to sabotage other players, but there are a small variety of vehicles you can choose which alter the gameplay experience slightly. This game did receive good review scores at the time, ranging between 9 and 9.5 out of 10, but I will say I do agree with the criticism from Electronic Gaming Monthly stating that the feeling of speed isn't really there. It is a game I don't mind coming back to every once in a while, but not one I would say is essential to play as opposed to some of the other racing games on the system. And yes, there are many more racing games that I could cover on this review, but for now I'm going to wrap up and move on to the sports games. And for this list, I actually consulted a lot of online sources for what are the best games in each sport for the Super Nintendo. That way I can narrow it down and we're not going to be here all day talking about sports games. Growing up in Illinois in the mid-90s was a good time for me because everyone around me was a Chicago Bulls fan. This was the tail end of the Chicago Bulls Dream Team run, featuring Michael Jordan, and I don't think there was a single kid I know that didn't have a Michael Jordan t-shirt, collector's card, shoes, I mean, you name it, jersey, it was everywhere. And capitalizing on the popularity of basketball at that time, NBA Jam hit arcades in 1993. And I think the thing that makes this game live up well today is its arcade gameplay style. This game allows you to choose your players on a 2-on-2 match that is very arcadey and definitely has that rubber banding AI effect, where if you're getting a little too good, the game gets a lot better, but if you go down, the game doesn't play quite as hard. This game was an occasional rental from me because it was one that I only rented when I knew I had a friend to play it with. And this would also save me a bunch of quarters having rented the game, so I didn't have to play it in the arcades. The tight controls are also paired with a presentation style that I think still lives up well today, along with the voice himself announcing some of your moves. There's also NBA Jam Tournament Edition, which you can also get, and I wouldn't recommend one over the other. Either one of these you can't go wrong with.
EA Sports.
It's in the game.
But if you're looking more for a game of what was the EA Sports title to have from this system, I saw NBA Live 96 come up on a bunch of top 10 lists, and this has even been included in a few of the top 100 games of all time, not just basketball games. I didn't have too much to say about this game, except for this is definitely a 90s basketball game, not one of the ones you play on a modern system. And this is being included on the list as a recommendation from what other people say the best game is, so here it is if you want it. When I think of Tecmo Super Bowl, I actually think of the NES version. I always forget that there was a version on the Super Nintendo. And boy am I glad this game made it over. This style of play I think has lived up better than some of the other football games of the era, especially because there's now a clone game that you can get on cell phones that mimic this play style. This game pulls it off very well, even though it's from a side-scrolling view and doesn't use Mode 7. But seriously, if you're a fan of football games of this time period, you've definitely played this before, and is one I would recommend on the Super Nintendo, as this is one of my favorite football games of all time, although, again, I'm used to the NES version in style, but this one gives it a nice graphical upgrade. Bill Walsh College Football comes in at a close second in terms of the best football games on the Super Nintendo, and this is one that I hadn't played before this review, but I think I played it on the Sega CD. And all I can say is the gameplay is not bad, but I have very little interest in football college teams from the early 90s. Super Play Action Football is also one that is highly rated on the Super Nintendo, but is one that I didn't enjoy, again because of this isometric perspective. It just throws my depth perception off. I'm beginning to suspect that's just a me issue and may not be one that affects everybody. And of course around this time is when John Madden Football became a thing on all consoles of this era. It started out on the Genesis and then eventually made its way over to the Super Nintendo. And it may be hard to realize this today, but that was a big deal. Sega consoles were known for their sports titles, and the fact that the Super Nintendo was getting one as well was something that Super Nintendo fans would go crazy over. But when looking at a list of the best football games on the Super Nintendo, it actually took a while for me to get to a Madden game, but whenever it was mentioned, John Madden Football 93 seemed to be the one to go with, so that's the one I will recommend in this review. Again, it's not one of my personal taste, but it is Madden on the Super Nintendo. I have a coworker that knows that I collect retro games, and the first thing he asked me is if I had a Super Nintendo, and I said yes. The very next question was, do you have Ken Griffey Jr. Baseball? My response was not one that he was expecting. I said, why should I? So apparently I was unaware at the time that this game was probably the pinnacle of baseball games of its day. I've only just recently played this for the first time, so it's not one that I can really give my personal opinion on, but baseball games were not one that I was really going after back in the day, and when looking at reviews, this is kind of all over the place. I see an 8 out of 10 versus 6 out of 10. But if you were to ask my coworker, this is the one to own. Actually, either one of the Ken Griffey Jr. games on here he said he would be okay with. And yes, when looking at other people's top 10 baseball games lists, this makes a frequent appearance.
Save.
And often right next to those games on the list is Baseball Simulator 1000. And if you want to learn more about this game, I have already covered it in my early games video, when I finished up the games that came out the same year the console launched. But a franchise that is a personal favorite from my childhood is Super Bases Loaded. The first game looks very generic, and I think that's just because it's one of the earliest titles on the Super Nintendo, but it's one that I had a lot of fun coming back to from time to time, so this is one I would recommend as well, but that is 100% due to nostalgia reasons for me.
International Superstar Soccer.
When looking at soccer games, I see International Superstar Soccer often coming up near the top of their soccer games lists. And just looking at the presentation, I can tell you this game looks fantastic on the Super Nintendo. It's very detailed, and they also try to pipe in the most realistic sounding crowd noise they can on the Super Nintendo, and they have a very clear sounding announcer. One thing I had a hard time with when I was playing this is a little bit due to the isometric perspective. It's hard to tell where you're aiming when you're kicking, but after a while you can kind of get the hang of it. When looking at reviews of this game back when it first came out, they were kind of lukewarm between a 7 and 7.5 out of 10. But when looking back on it, IGN ranked this as 64th on their top 100 SNES games of all time. So it appears this one has lived up better than others. Super Soccer is one that actually surprised me, was listed very highly as well for soccer games on the Super Nintendo. This is one I have played in the past, and I think I viewed it more as a tech demo, kind of like Mario's Tennis, when it came out on the Virtual Boy, because I saw this as a sports game that can also showcase the 3D perspective that the Super Nintendo could do. This one's alright, I'd give it around a 7 out of 10 myself, and I would say it's not essential, but one that if you like soccer, you would definitely want to pick up. And lastly, this one does not get shown on a lot of favorite soccer games lists, but I think I wanted to show it just because the fact that I have this in my collection, and nowadays it fetches a pretty high price. I just want to warn people away from this game. This is a very mediocre soccer game, just featuring Mega Man. I usually get bored of it within a couple minutes of popping the cartridge in, and so does everyone else when I've tried to play it 2-player, so if you're one of those people who feel like, oh, this should be fun because it's Mega Man and soccer, it's very disappointing and definitely not worth the price unless you're going for it as a collector's piece.
It's in the game.
In terms of hockey games, I've been told you really can't go wrong with any of the NHL games from EA Sports on this system. The only one I happen to have on hand is NHL 96, so this is the only one I can actually personally attest that I've played, and yeah, it plays pretty well for a hockey game on the Super Nintendo. I was a bit surprised that they don't use Mode 7 when you're scrolling up and down the playfield, but I actually feel like that helps out the gameplay that they don't do that, because you don't have that morphed perspective as you're playing. Again, there's not one I'd recommend more than the others, and the other reviews that I've seen are pretty well even-keeled across this entire series, so any of these are the ones to get. Recently, I asked another friend of mine who likes wrestling a lot more than I do, what are the best wrestling games on the Super Nintendo? And his genuine reply was, I don't remember any of them. Now, I realize that's not going to be the case with everybody who liked wrestling at this time, but that's kind of my opinion of these games overall, is that none of these are particularly memorable to me. But if I had to pick one to try for everybody, it would probably be Royal Rumble. This one has the best review scores of any of the wrestling games on the platform, but it could be tied with WWF Super WrestleMania, which I kind of felt to be a bit too underdeveloped. I found the controls to maybe be a little delayed when I press them. It's just not as responsive as some of the other wrestling games on here, which is what personally keeps me from recommending it as number one. Definitely feels like one of the first games they made on this system, and maybe the other ones they'd build on. But after those two, I'd recommend WWF WrestleMania the arcade game, which is basically WrestleMania remade with Mortal Kombat style graphics. Sadly, this one just didn't seem as fun to me, as it really felt like they were trying to make the Super Nintendo do something it really couldn't do, and this game is incredibly watered down compared to the other home ports because of the system's limitations. And last on my list of ranking the wrestling games on the Super Nintendo is Raw. I really feel like this one isn't as good as its predecessor, which the original developers, Royal Rumble, is the one that made this one. It's just not done as well, and I would recommend skipping it. In terms of boxing games, the only one I can honestly recommend is Super Punch-Out. This game is the sequel to the highly successful NES title, and although I feel like it does translate well to the Super Nintendo, I just didn't enjoy this one as much. The NES had that iconic rockin' soundtrack that went with every single fight, and this game really just doesn't seem to hit that same note. Again, it also feels like my characters are more sluggish than in the NES version, but in a welcome change, the difficulty seems to be scaled back just a little bit. This is one that I did rent a lot back in the day, but I didn't own it until years later when I started collecting for the Super Nintendo, but this is one of the first titles I grabbed when I started collecting. Overall, I would recommend this as a game you should get for the Super Nintendo, but I realize it's not going to be for everybody. I'd give this around an 8 out of 10 myself, and I do want to reiterate that you are not getting the same playstyle as the original game. If that's what you're expecting, you're going to be disappointed.
Fight! Knockout!
If you've been following my channel for a while, you may be aware that I am actually a big fan of golf games on almost any system. Although around the time the Super Nintendo was relevant, I don't think I was playing them as much. So again, for this review, I had to rely on recommendations from others, and the first one that came across my radar was the IREM Skins Game Challenge, which was also known as Major Title in Japan. And in terms of playing this game, I have to say it reminded me a lot of Neo Turf Masters on the Neo Geo. And that is not a bad thing at all. The game has more of an arcade feel, and I think that helps the game age a bit more gracefully, as they weren't trying to go for a realistic golf simulator, because let's face it, the Super Nintendo was going to be good, but not great at producing a golf game, at least in terms of realism. This game received good reviews when it came out, getting between a 9 and 8.5 out of 10, although those have softened with more modern reviews. I would be more tempted to give it a 9 out of 10. I definitely enjoyed this one. PGA Tour 96 from EA Sports actually went more of a golf simulation route, and they did an admirable job, at least the best they can do on the Super Nintendo. The playstyle actually reminds me a bit of Mario Golf, although it's not as fine-tuned as in that game. There's a brief pause between each shot as the game has to re-render where your ball hits so that you can see it from that perspective. But overall, this game isn't bad either. I'd give it around an 8 or a 7.5 out of 10. But the game I had the most fun with back in the day when I used to rent it, and the one I had more fun with now, is Kirby's Dream Course. This game is a bit of a reimagining of mini-golf, but with Kirby and with special power-ups and enemies. The game is definitely more arcade in feel in terms of controls and playing it, but what I really started getting vibes of were some of those early Flash golf games from around the year 2000 to 2005. There were a bunch of mini-golf games from this top-down perspective, and I remember enjoying those very much, so this was a particular thrill to me. I definitely recommend challenging another player to see who can get the better score on this one, and just have fun with it. I will note the review scores for this game are again all over the place, between a 6 out of 10 and a 9 out of 10, and I'm going to land somewhere close to the top. I'm going to say 8, possibly 8.5 out of 10. I would definitely recommend this to mini-golf enthusiasts, as well as fans of the Kirby series. There are more sports games that I can get into on this system, but I feel like I've covered the ones of note, at least the ones that I enjoyed on this system. Everything else can be summed up, at least from me, just by saying, this is the insert sport name here for the Super Nintendo. But overall, even though I'm not the biggest fan of sports games, there are some in this list that I absolutely enjoyed and definitely want to come back to. However, there's also a bunch of games that I really wish I'd never played and hopefully never have to again. This is also a genre that I really feel like none of these is played well as a single-player game experience. There are some exceptions, most notably Super Punch-Out, which is only a one-player game. But even still, in 2022 it was discovered that there is a two-player mode that is hidden and can be activated with a cheat code. It just goes to show that most sports games are not meant to be played with just one player. That said, please let me know in the comments below any of your personal favorite sports games, and if I included them in this video, or if I need to go back and take a look at it if I skipped over it. Otherwise, we only have one more genre that I'm going to cover, and I'm just going to call it miscellaneous, and include whatever games that are worthy of note that I haven't yet covered in a specific genre. So stay tuned for that video coming out to you real soon, and if it has already, look for the link at the end of the video. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.